It was a cold winter night when the case of Emily Dawson shocked the United States. Emily, a 23-year-old woman, was on trial for a brutal crime that shook the nation. She was the sole survivor of a tragic bus accident that occurred at midnight on a deserted road. The bus, which was relatively full, collided with an embankment and exploded, killing all the passengers on board. However, the circumstances surrounding the accident were strange and disturbing. At the crime scene, Emily was found in a state of shock, holding a revolver. 3 people, including the bus driver, had been shot before the collision, and all the evidence pointed to Emily as the culprit. The young woman, who worked as a prostitute, was immediately detained and charged with first-degree murder. When questioned by the police, she only repeated in a low voice, "I had no choice, I needed the money." Emily's trial was one of the most media-covered of the decade. All the news outlets covered the case relentlessly, and public opinion was divided between those who saw her as a victim of circumstances and those who believed she was a cold and calculating killer. The prosecution painted a horrific picture of Emily, describing her as a desperate woman who, upon realizing she couldn't escape her past, decided to end the lives of everyone on the bus. On the other hand, the defense argued that Emily was in an extreme state of despair and that something more sinister might have happened on that bus, something that no one had yet understood. The defense attorneys tried to convince the jury that Emily was not a murderer, but a victim of inexplicable circumstances. However, the evidence was damning. Her fingerprints were on the gun, and the fact that she was found alone at the accident scene only strengthened the prosecution's case. The jury, composed of 12 people, was indecisive. The case was complex, and the implications were profound. Society was in an uproar, and the trial became a spectacle of horror and morality. The final decision was made with a single tie-breaking vote, cast by Robert Hale, a middle-aged man known for his bitter and skeptical personality. Robert did not sympathize with Emily and saw in her everything he despised: weakness, immorality, and a life that, in his eyes, was not worth living. The verdict was delivered. Emily Dawson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the sentence was read, Emily remained silent, her gaze empty and distant, as if she were already dead inside. The only phrase that escaped her lips was the same one she had repeated from the beginning: "I had no choice, I needed the money." Emily's conviction marked the end of a dark chapter in the country's history, but it also began a series of even more disturbing events. The name Emily Dawson would not be forgotten anytime soon, and the shadow of her trial would loom over everyone who participated in it, especially over Robert Hale, who would soon begin to question what really happened that fateful night. After the trial, Robert Hale tried to continue his life as usual. He was a practical man, someone who only believed in what he could see and touch. To him, the case of Emily Dawson had been a clear matter of justice, a woman of questionable morals who had committed a terrible crime and therefore deserved to pay for it. But something began to disturb him, something he wasn't willing to admit. Robert had always prided himself on his rationality. To him, the world was black and white, and people were responsible for their own choices. He despised any form of superstition or mysticism. However, after the verdict, he began to have strange and disturbing dreams. In the dreams, he was inside a bus, the same one where the accident had occurred. He saw the faces of the passengers, filled with fear and despair, and felt an oppressive presence around him, something he couldn't define but that made him wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat. Robert dismissed these dreams as the product of his tired mind. He refused to believe that something more was happening. "It's just guilt," he thought, though he would never admit it out loud. It's natural to feel this way after deciding someone's fate. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to grow. He wondered, in moments of weakness, if perhaps he had been wrong, if maybe something else had happened on that bus, something that no one could explain. The supernatural events began subtly. Robert started noticing movements out of the corner of his eye, shadows that crept across the room when he was alone. The lights in his house flickered for no apparent reason, and the air around him seemed to grow cold at unexpected moments. One night, when he looked in the mirror, he saw for a brief second the reflection of a young woman behind him, her eyes fixed on him, filled with unspeakable pain. When he turned around, there was no one there. He dismissed these experiences as hallucinations, the result of a stressed mind. But the dreams continued, becoming more vivid each time. In one of them, he was back on the bus, but this time, he wasn't alone. He could hear murmurs, voices whispering in a language he didn't recognize. He felt he was being watched, judged, and when he woke up, it took him hours to calm down. Robert began to avoid sleep, fearing what he might encounter in his dreams. His skepticism, once unshakable, began to waver, but he refused to believe that anything supernatural was happening. He was Robert Hale, a man of reason, of logic. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that he was being followed, watched. During the day, he behaved as usual, hiding his discomfort behind a facade of arrogance and disdain for anything that didn't fit his narrow view of the world. He ridiculed those who still talked about the Emily Dawson case, calling them superstitious fools. But at night, when he was alone, he felt that the reality around him was changing, distorting in ways he couldn't understand. He began to realize that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that something terrible was lurking, waiting for him, something that had roots on that bus and that, somehow, was connected to him. But Robert was stubborn, too proud to admit that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have all the answers. What Robert Hale didn't yet know was that the answers he had been avoiding were about to find him, and that the line between skepticism and belief was about to become irrelevant in the face of the horror that was approaching. The case of Emily Dawson quickly became much more than a sensational trial. It turned into an urban legend that spread like wildfire through towns and cities across the United States. Shortly after her execution, reports of bus accidents began to surface from various parts of the country. Initially, authorities believed they were merely tragic coincidences, but the frequency and nature of the accidents were too disturbing to ignore. The accidents occurred at any time of day, but midnight became the most feared hour. Buses traveling at that time were often found wrecked, with no plausible explanation. The authorities were baffled. The vehicles were regularly inspected, and the drivers were experienced, yet the accidents continued. Death seemed to follow those who boarded buses in the early morning hours, and soon people began to fear taking any public transportation, especially at midnight. Stories began to circulate. Some said that before the accidents, passengers would see a young woman sitting at the back of the bus, her eyes empty and fixed on a distant point, her clothes tattered and burned, as if she had emerged from a fire. Those who tried to approach her reported an overwhelming sense of despair and terror, as if their souls were being ripped from their bodies. These passengers rarely survived to tell their stories, but the accounts that did emerge became part of modern folklore. In cities, true cults began to form around the name of Emily Dawson. People who believed that the young woman had been unjustly condemned started visiting her grave, leaving flowers, candles, and messages of repentance. Some came to ask for forgiveness, others to plead for protection against what they believed to be the wrath of Emily's vengeful spirit. Her grave became a pilgrimage site, especially at midnight, where the most courageous or desperate came hoping to avoid the fate that had befallen so many others. Newspapers began publishing sensational stories about the accidents and the alleged sightings of Emily. Headlines like "Emily Dawson's Vengeful Spirit Still Haunts the Roads" and "Emily's Curse. Beware of Taking a Bus at Midnight" sold like hotcakes. Television programs dedicated to the paranormal began exploring the case, interviewing survivors and experts in supernatural phenomena, who theorized about a possible connection between Emily's execution and the wave of tragedies. The fear became so palpable that many bus drivers refused to work the midnight shift. Those who still accepted the shift did so out of desperation or stubborn skepticism, but even they began to adopt superstitious rituals. They hung charms from the rearview mirrors, prayed silently before starting their routes, or avoided driving on the roads where the most macabre accidents had occurred. Passengers who still needed to take the bus at night would make the sign of the cross upon entering, sitting as close to the driver as possible, as if that could ward off danger. However, no matter what they did, the fear persisted. It was a primal fear, something that affected people on a level they couldn't explain but felt deeply. Even the skeptics, those who scoffed at the stories, began to hesitate before taking a bus at night. The streets, once full of life, became silent and deserted after nightfall, as people preferred to walk long distances or pay for expensive taxis rather than risk their lives on a bus. Everyday conversations became filled with reports and speculations. In schools, children whispered about the legend of Emily Dawson in dark corridors, daring each other to take the last bus of the night. In bars, workers heatedly debated whether it was all just a morbid coincidence, while others insisted it was real, that Emily was out there, waiting for her revenge. Midnight became a moment of national tension. Families gathered earlier, and the streets emptied before the dreaded hour struck. Those forced to take a bus at that time felt as though they were signing their own death warrant, nervously watching every passenger, expecting to see Emily's pale face at the back of the vehicle. Despite all these signs, the authorities couldn't stop the accidents. And for many, it became clear that the legend of Emily Dawson was not just a story to scare children, but a real curse hanging over everyone, especially those who, in one way or another, had crossed paths with the young woman. And for the man who had cast the deciding vote, Robert Hale, this curse was about to become more personal than he could have ever imagined. Robert Hale was fed up with the stories. The people around him seemed to have completely lost their sense of reason, surrendering to an irrational fear fueled by rumors and superstitions. To him, it was all utter nonsense. The bus accidents, though tragic, were merely coincidences, the result of mechanical failures, human error, or adverse weather conditions. He refused to believe that anything supernatural was behind it and was determined to prove it. As the days passed, the paranoia around him only grew. His colleagues at work avoided talking about the Emily Dawson case in his presence, knowing he would react with scorn and disdain. But secretly, Robert couldn't help but think about the trial and the role he had played. Though he would never admit it out loud, he wondered if he had done the right thing by casting the deciding vote that condemned Emily to death. The phrase she had repeated during the trial echoed in his mind, bringing an unease he couldn't shake. Robert knew that the only way to put a definitive end to those ridiculous stories was to confront them head-on. He decided he would take a bus at midnight, the hour everyone feared. If nothing happened, as he was certain it wouldn't, he could return and rub the truth in everyone's faces. It was a matter of principle, a way to reaffirm his unwavering belief in rationality and the justice he believed he had served. On the appointed night, Robert waited patiently at the bus stop while the city around him was engulfed in an unsettling silence. The clock read 11:50 p.m., and the feeling of isolation was palpable. He noticed the street was deserted, not a soul in sight. The city lights seemed dimmer, as if the darkness was slowly swallowing everything around. But Robert stood firm, determined to prove that it was all just a ridiculous superstition. When the bus finally arrived, right at midnight, Robert felt a shiver run down his spine, but he forced himself to ignore it. He boarded the bus without hesitation, paying the fare with a determination that bordered on stubbornness. The driver, a middle-aged man with deep bags under his eyes, merely nodded in silent acknowledgement. Robert chose a seat in the middle of the bus, with a clear view of both the front and back, and settled in for what he expected to be a boring ride. However, as soon as the bus started moving, Robert noticed something strange. The atmosphere around him seemed to change, as if the air had become heavier and denser. The bus's interior lights began to flicker slightly, and he felt a sense of vertigo, as if he were being pulled into a distant place. He looked out the window, expecting to see the familiar cityscape, but instead he saw only a deep, almost tangible darkness. Suddenly, the bus jolted, as if it had crossed an invisible threshold, and Robert found himself enveloped in absolute silence. He looked around, confused, and realized that something was terribly wrong. The passengers around him, who had previously seemed indifferent, were now sitting rigidly, as if they were statues. And then he saw her. At the back of the bus, Emily Dawson was sitting, but not as he had seen her during the trial. She was alive, young, and beautiful, chatting cheerfully on the phone. Robert could hear parts of the conversation, enough to understand that she was telling someone about her plans for the future. She spoke enthusiastically about how she had finally saved enough money to leave her current life behind and start anew. Her voice was full of hope, which violently contrasted with the grim and disturbing image he had of her. Robert tried to stand up, but found that he couldn't move. It was as if he were glued to his seat, forced to watch what was happening. The bus continued on its route, but now he knew he was no longer in his city, nor even in his time. He had been transported back to the fateful night when Emily and the other passengers met their fate. As Emily continued to talk on the phone, unaware of what was about to happen, Robert began to feel the true weight of his actions. He was seeing the woman as she really was, a young woman full of dreams and hopes, not the criminal he had helped to condemn. He felt a wave of regret and dread, but was powerless to do anything about it. The sensation of being watched, of being trapped in a cycle of events he couldn't control, began to intensify. Robert knew something was about to happen, something he wouldn't be able to prevent. And as the bus continued its journey, he began to understand that this was the real punishment, to be forced to relive the horror of that night over and over again, without being able to change what was about to happen. Robert Hale's bus continued its route, and the atmosphere inside the vehicle became increasingly oppressive. The sight of Emily Dawson was a shock, a cruel reality he had never imagined facing. She was sitting there, talking on the phone with an excitement that contrasted sharply with the impending despair. The passengers around Emily were growing more restless. A group of men, who seemed to know her, began making sarcastic and hostile comments. They called her cruel names, accusing her of being a whore and society's scum. Their words were sharp as knives, and the insults piled up, growing in intensity and verbal violence. Emily tried to remain calm, but her despair was evident. She attempted to justify her situation, but her words were drowned out by the men's derision. "You don't understand," she said, her voice increasingly shaky. "I just wanted to help my family. I had the money. I was going to get out of this life." With each word, her voice grew more laden with pain and sadness. The insults escalated into physical assaults. The men began shoving her and hitting her, leaving her crumpled on the bus floor, amidst tears and cries for help. The rest of the passengers, terrified and indifferent, offered no assistance. They turned their faces away, pretending nothing was happening, unable to face the terror unfolding before them. At the height of the violence, Emily managed to crawl toward a revolver that had fallen near one of the attackers. With a bloodied face and trembling hands, she grabbed the gun, trying to defend herself. The bus was in absolute chaos, with screams of panic and Emily's struggle for survival creating a frenzy of hopelessness. As the situation unfolded, the bus made a sudden turn. Emily, trying to stand, stumbled, and in a moment of absolute panic, fired the gun. The shot hit the driver, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. The bus began to roll over, and fire quickly spread, engulfing the structure and the passengers in flames. What Robert Hale witnessed was a spectacle of absolute horror. He was trapped in his seat, powerless, forced to watch Emily's suffering. The flames and smoke made the environment almost unbearable, and the bus turned into a hell of pain and despair. Robert felt a growing pain in his chest, a reflection of the panic and anguish taking over everyone inside the bus. In his final moments, Robert looked outside the bus, and what he saw paralyzed him with horror. Emily was out there, amidst the chaos, completely in shock. She was lying on the ground, her gaze lost and vacant, desperately and incoherently repeating, "I had no choice, I needed the money." Her eyes were fixed on a distant point, as if she was struggling to comprehend what had happened to her and everyone around her. The bus was now engulfed in flames, and the intense heat was almost unbearable. Robert felt his vision blur, and the pain in his body grew increasingly acute. The bus, with all its passengers, was condemning him to a similar fate. In his final moments, he saw the image of Emily, a young woman who, despite her suffering, seemed to be the only one to survive a night of horror that he was now condemned to relive. Robert's last sight was of Emily, still in shock, repeating the same phrase, while the bus burned in the background. And then, darkness took over, and he was consumed by the same terrible fate he had witnessed and helped to condemn. After the tragedy, the story of Emily Dawson continued to haunt the public imagination. Bus accidents still occasionally occur, and some people wonder if they are mere coincidences or if Emily continues to remind everyone of her tragedy. Urban legends persist, and the fear of midnight never completely disappeared. In every accident, in every story, the memory of Emily remains a dark reminder of what happened that fateful night, an echo of the words she screamed in the height of her despair.